having received his advice of intolerance for failure, it looks as if we're going to the other side of the coin for incentivising successful public sector IT. So over to Professor Ross Anderson.
Right. I'm not quite as much of an optimist as Martin. I've got a different take on things, but let me talk about incentives, which is how a lot of stuff fails. Back in the 1960s, Brian Randall of Newcastle coined the term software engineering. People in the early 60s had begun to notice that about a third of all large software projects failed. And this kicked off a huge effort to produce better engineering tools and better project management tools, compilers, case workbenches, everything like that, to help people manage the complexity, which is one aspect of most system failures. And we've now got all this stuff. So what's happened to the rate of project failure? Well, in the corporate sector, it's still about 30%. So was the effort in vain? No, we build much bigger, better disasters nowadays. So what does this tell us? It tells us that software project failure isn't a techie thing. It's fundamentally about people, about organizations, about incentives, about how people behave. Now, in the private sector, you can understand that 30% software project failure may be reasonable, because profits are reward for risk and directors are hard to take risks on behalf of shareholders. And sometimes it doesn't work. Hey, that's life. So you'd think the public sector would be different. After all, civil servants are risk averse. This is notorious. Yet, it doesn't seem to work that way. One of our government CEOs at DWP admitted last year that only about 30% of government projects work. Right? So instead of 30% failure, you're looking at 70% failure. What does this mean? Well, it's a hell of a lot of money. As Martin pointed out, most of Britain's expenditure on big IT systems is now in the public sector. So that's, call it 10 billion a year being wasted. What could we do about that? Well, for a start, we could try and understand it. And one of the things that we've been doing over the past 6 or 7 years is trying to bring together economists and engineers to understand why it is that systems fail. Now, this was kicked off in the field of information security, where we found that many large security failures happened because the incentives were wrong. The people who were guarding a system weren't the people who suffered when it failed. Hospital medical record systems were bought by medical directors or by trust chief executives. So they were very good at collecting accounting data and providing data for research, but they weren't very good at protecting patient privacy. Why? The patients hadn't been there at the table when the supplier was being briefed. Now, recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, this field has been spreading out into the economics of dependability, and we've been looking at things like dependability growth models. Does software get better or worse over time? Does the rate at which you apply patches to fix stuff run ahead of or run behind the rate at which you invent new features which make stuff more buggy? The patching cycle is important. On the internet scale, strategy-proof protocols are important. You don't want to set the rules of the game so that people have got too big an incentive to cheat. Now, one of the things about this work is that so far we've been considering largely what the incentives are on individual programmers and on firms, all of whom are acting as economic principles. But as many of you will be aware, many of the most interesting and perverse things in economics happen when you start considering agency issues. What happens in a company when managers start optimizing their own incentives, their own utility, rather than the shareholders' utility. Right? That's why we give company directors stock options, to try and align their incentives a little bit with those of the shareholders by making them shareholders. But what can you do in the public sector? Well, just as you've got the new institutional economics explains what goes on in companies, there are some people who have been doing work on how this applies in the public sector. Economists like Buchanan and Tulloch. And their critical insight was that a modern state is no longer a personal kingdom. Right? If you were talking to Henry VII, you could have given the kind of economic advice that Marshall did to a beneficent social planner. Henry VII owned the kingdom, he had a son to inherit from him, so you could reasonably assume that he would act in the best interests of the kingdom, because it was his, right? End of problem. But nowadays, because of the evil side effects that such government has. We've got more complex structures. We've got ministers, we've got officials, and they all have incentives that differ slightly from King Henry VII. Ministers want to get in the papers and they want to get re-elected. Officials want to maximize control. Can we get any insights from this body of work into system failure? Well, here's the first cut. I think that this would be a very interesting research project to lay the economics of dependability alongside public choice and see where the gap analysis leads you. But to take an example from my own experience 20 years ago, I was busy developing a branch automation system for a high street bank. And in a project like that, what you've got to do is first commit to a specification. That means you've got to get the bank's board of directors to agree exactly what this thing is going to do, right? And then you've got to get them to shut up, keep out your way for 2 years while you build it. And then once you field it, and it turns out that what they thought their business was doing isn't actually what it's doing, then you've got to get them to take some pretty hard decisions pretty quickly. Right. How feasible is this for a minister? Well, ministers and projects don't mix. I think everybody knows that. I see many smiles around the room. Why? Well, the first point, this is actually due to Lord Wilson when I discussed this with him. He said, ministers aren't actually hired to do stuff. They're there to resolve conflicting interests in society. And many ministers fail because they don't really understand this. Now, most of the people who go to a minister saying, Minister, I need X, or Minister, I need Y, are, as rulers have known for a long time, rascals who should be sent away. They're rent seekers, they're troublemakers, people are trying all sorts of false alarm raising and fear mongering in order to create monopolies for themselves or their friends or gain unfair advantage and so on and so forth. But a minister who simply beheaded everybody who came to see him wouldn't stay in office long. So a sensible minister is of course just going to respond to most demands by flanneling and doing nothing. But it's a different kind of function in society. It's a different kind of person who is good at it. The sort of person who makes a good minister is unlikely to make a good project manager, and vice versa. And above all, the last thing that a minister wants to do is to take lots and lots of hard decisions up front before it's really necessary to do so, and then be explicit about them. Because every time you take a decision, you upset somebody, and the more people you upset, the shorter your career. Okay, ministers and projects don't mix too. The second thing a good project client has to do is to shut up for 2 years while the system's being built. Again, how feasible is that for a minister in the modern media age? And the third thing that you have to do is once the thing gets rolled out, and what you thought was a good idea turns out not to be, then you have to accept quickly and publicly that some screw-up has happened, that promises won't be delivered, and in future the business will work in this other way instead. That's not very easy either, is it? And then there's various other toxins. Power struggles. The Department of Health has been fighting with doctors since 1910 over who would control the electronic patient record. Or before 1991, it was who would control the patient record. It goes right back to Lloyd George, this one. Hey, and when you have got a system being built as part of an ongoing war like that, what do you expect? Then you've got electoral projects such as ID cards. Brilliant piece of political engineering. It split the Conservative front bench. It got the Daily Mail voters on board. It was wonderful. It got the 2005 election in the bag. But as security engineering, I still wait to hear what these things are supposedly useful for. Then, of course, anything to do with security, well, go to the FIPR website and look at our comments on the Cabinet Office Framework of Information Assurance back last April, and you see what I mean. Now, all this sort of stuff is completely comprehensible to an economist. Security economics is something we've now studied a bit. We understand the incentives. We understand why the intelligence services prefer offensive rather than defensive information warfare, and so on and so forth. So what's the result? The result is that public sector projects are started with eye-catching but unrealistic objectives. The stated objectives get changed many times as ministers bid for media attention. You know, if you're the second minister at the Department of Administration, and you get the third Thursday of every month, you'd better have an initiative to announce when your time comes round. Now, suppliers know this, so they lowball the contract because they know they can make tons of money on all the changes that will come down later. And this, I think, gives you an insight into the paradox of this. The public sector's famously risk-averse, but why do you see such extravagantly risky behaviour when it comes to the purchase of computer systems? Well, ministers are in a tournament for promotion. It's not their money that they're gambling with. The chickens will usually roost on the next guy's watch, and the suppliers know that 99% of the time failure will be covered up. Despite all the problems in the NHS computer project, I don't think you can see anytime soon the Secretary of State for Health putting on sackcloth and ashes and walking through Trafalgar Square saying, woe is me, we have screwed up. No, forget it, it's not going to happen. So what sort of public sector projects do work? Well, congestion charge is one that we're often given as an example. Very, very simple and stable specification. Every car that comes into London and doesn't pay us £5 by midnight is to be billed £40. Full stop, end. That one sentence is the specification. Anybody can engineer to that. And it's not going to change under your feet halfway through. Another example, land registry systems, done by officials incrementally without ministers even taking notice of the fact that they were being done. Great stuff. Well done, chaps. So what's the future? Well, nowadays, big complex projects are things that evolve incrementally rather than being built from scratch. Whether it's PC software like Office or something like Google or a social networking site like Facebook, lots and lots of little changes over time in response to user demand, sometimes several changes a day if it's something like Google, changes every few weeks in Facebook, getting feedback from users, that's how it goes. Now, if government wants to build ever more complex systems that actually work, then it's going to have to reinvent itself around evolutionary systems development. But what does that actually mean? Suppose you're building medical systems, for example. Here's where the rubber hits the road. If you've got a GP's system in a GP's surgery, at present, the GPs buy them and pay for them. So if you want, for example, diabetes links and you're a GP, you can phone up the EMIS rep and say, we want this, or you can go to the EMIS conference and make a speech, and all the other GPs will go, yeah, we want diabetes links, and the programmer sitting in the back will write down diabetes links, and it will happen in the next service pack. Once you centralize that, the GP who wants diabetes links can write a letter to the Secretary of State and wait. So there's another possible future, and this is interesting. Is there going to be a new fault line in politics between big government and small government, but conditioned by the complexity of technology and the constraints that it places on political ambition? Now, economists realized back in the 60s, and almost all politicians by the events of 1989, that macroeconomics places some fairly hard limits on what's politically achievable in a plural society. And I reckon that this 70% system failure rate is telling us that microeconomics also places limits. Societies are complex systems, like Facebook or Google, but even more complex. And if you try and manage stuff centrally, you can only get so far. And I suspect that this is possibly the next big divide between small government folk, liberals, individualists, call it what you want, and the big government folks on both left and right. There are limits to what's practical. We don't yet have these ideas embedded in our political culture. We haven't yet even started the conversation. This isn't a left-right thing. It's partly a small versus big government thing, but above all, it's about complexity, and it's about evolution, and it's about how evolution happens and the extent to which some aspects of that can be managed by particular groups, interests, and players.